Hi, this is Kevin. Welcome to my lecture for Chapter 6 of the Spurrier and Topi book. Chapter 6 is about project planning and creating the product backlog. Okay, and I want to just, before I begin the lecture, I just want to put it into the context of how we're using this chapter in the current semester. So I'm currently teaching in the fall of 2021. The week coming up, week 5, is about initiating and planning for the waterfall approach. Okay, and then the next week that we're going to do is initiating and planning for the agile approach. Now, how's that different than the chapter that we're reading? Well, I think this is closest chapter in the book, but Spurrier and Topi are very ambitious, and they want to say that initiating and planning can be done in a similar way regardless of the approach that you take. Okay? Yeah, you're going to have to use different kinds of tools to a certain extent, but they want to present a similar kind of thinking that you could apply to initiating and planning a waterfall project and an agile project. So a lot of the picture that they paint in chapter 6 is in trying to knit all these concepts together. And I'm not convinced that's a good idea. Okay, so as we go through the chapter, I'm going to point out the parts that I think are a good idea and the parts that are not. Now, where are we headed for our week here in the course? Well, we're going to be creating a waterfall planning document, okay? And what's it going to look like? Well, let's see. I have the planning document that we're going to do is called a project scope statement, and it looks like this. Okay, it really looks like the kind of documents that systems analysts and project managers have been asked to create in the traditional approach to projects for years. It's kind of a short form-oriented report, okay, in which we identify the project and the players. We try to express what the problem or the opportunity is. We try to express the objectives. We try to describe the project. And as we're describing the project, we're trying to do it in a way that outlines the scope of what we're going to address. Okay, what's it going to do? What kind of functions is it going to have? Okay, we're going to talk about what are the benefits we expect to get, what are the deliverables that are going to come out of the next part of the project, and about how long that is going to take. Okay, and this is sort of a project management kind of document that is going to keep us on track. All right. Now, next week, when we take the Agile approach, we're going to find out that the Agile people have their own kind of documents that they produce, including this thing called a vision statement. It's pretty close to what you see here, but it has a different format. And they're going to have lists of user stories that form a product backlog that are kind of akin to a list of all these kind of use cases that we're listing here in the document for the current week. And These two documents that I'm having you produce are pretty much things that you'll see people use in the field on, for this week, a traditional project, and for next week, an agile project. Okay. Whereas I think Spurrier and Topi, to get back to chapter 6, are trying to find some way to knit these things together into a unified whole. So we can use one set of language for whatever approach we're going to take, and try to achieve some kind of unified thinking. And my fear for our current week is it's going to sow confusion. So as I go through the chapter, I'm going to try to sow as little confusion about this as we possibly can. Perhaps I'm not giving Spurrier and Topi the justice that they deserve, but um, it, it's our course, and we'll proceed accordingly. Okay? So let's get started with these slides. Um, so, uh, so what they're really talking about here is what are we going to do to plan the activities of the project? Okay. So they kind of focus a little bit more on the planning and a little bit less on the initiating the project and getting a clear idea of what the scope is going to be. So, how to plan and integrate systems project activities in a hybrid um, approach in this pre-construction phase. We're going to need to support big requirements up front and big design up front. Okay. And they want to show us how we might be able to do that using traditional plan-driven project planning tools. Okay, so the project planning tools that are traditionally used in plan-driven projects are not the same tools that are typically used in agile projects. If we're going to do iterative sprint-based software construction, we're going to create a product backlog and initial sprint planning. We're going to be using non-traditional agile planning tools and techniques. Okay, so they're kind of mixing apples and oranges here because they would really like us to be able to choose the best of breed for whatever we're trying to do. Okay, I think this a part of the chapter is a little confusing. One interesting point that they make here is that they really think that if you're going to buy some kind of a software package, which they refer to in true kind of academic terms as a COTS software configuration project, well, then you can probably take a really traditional plan-driven approach to that, and they have a whole chapter for that in chapter 7, which in the current semester we're not going to cover. Okay, they're pointing out here the kind of things that have to go on that they're talking about within the chapter. So in terms of business analysis, specifying the initial requirements. In terms of project planning and implementation approach selection, creating a draft statement of work. In terms of functional and initial technical design, specify the functional design, specify the technical design in terms of final project approval and execution planning, plan change management, and plan project execution. Again, I think one of the things that's pretty challenging for this text is it's talking about systems analysis and project management all at the same time. And don't think that's a helpful way to learn. Okay. Okay. So they talk about Gantt charts here, and I think this is a good part of the chapter. Okay. Uh, uh, Traditional approaches to managing a project um, have used project planning techniques, um, which have been around since the late 1950s. Okay. And in this approach, we identify all the tasks that have to be done. Okay. And typically we put them into some kind of a product in which each of the tasks has a detail line. And sometimes some of the products, like this one here, this looks like it came out of a planning tool like Microsoft Project. Okay. And uh, we have these lines that we call summary lines. So it's possible for this summary test foundation to have two subparts: site work and footings, and pour concrete. Okay, and you can even have things get summarized at more levels than that. And so we pick a duration for each of the activities, and then we put information into the planning tool that eventually allows all these lines, these are dependency lines, to be drawn. But what we essentially say is, in order to start a particular task, certain other tasks have to be complete. Okay, and this sort of allows us to not be coming up with a plan where we're doing kind of infeasible things. The kind of example of this I like to talk about is, let's say we were going to paint a house. And typically, if you're going to paint a house, you start by pressure washing the house to get the dirt off and to knock off the paint that's kind of hanging loose. And then you scrape it. Okay, so then you get the rest of the loose paint, and then you sand it, right? And then after you sand it, you've got some bare wood or shingle or whatever siding. You're going to put on primer paint. You're going to prime it, and then you're going to put on a finish coat, and then you're going to probably put on a second finish coat, and then you're probably done, right? So you have to do each of those in order because they're sequential tasks, right? So this kind of planning tool, which can present the tasks in this kind of calendar-based bar chart called a Gantt chart, it's really good for projects that are pretty deterministic, like, say, building a house or painting a house, in which there is a deterministic order in which things have to be done, because there are a whole lot of things you can't do before other things have been finished, right? So they kind of introduce us to this kind of planning tool, which they call a Gantt chart, which is really an oversimplification. The original Gantt charts were these kind of charts in the right part here, and They had only the bars, they didn't have the arrows. And it's only in recent years that we've had these kind of mathematically driven planning tools, like a Microsoft project and its competitors, that we have taken these kind of Gantt charts and then annotated them further with these dependency line and arrows. Okay, so they've kind of simplified that and called that Gantt charts, which is kind of unfair to planning tools, but uh, I think they're kind of thinking this as a genre. Okay, and they're saying that that genre of planning tool is very good for um, uh, projects that have a lot of repetition risk. Okay. Um, we're doing a lot of activities repetitively, and we want to make sure that we do that with some fidelity to the original. And they think that it's not good for something that has a design risk. And I don't know whether they're really true. I don't know if they're really correct about that, but um, you can imagine that this kind of planning tool is um, more attuned to an approach to a project where we think that we can do all the planning up front. We can get all the requirements up front. We can do all the planning up front. And then it's just a matter of a bunch of construction activities. It's not hard to imagine that by the time you finished all the requirements and you did all the planning, that you could express a detailed plan for the construction and the testing and the installation that could be expressed in this kind of genre of planning tool. Okay. Um, do, do, do. So then they go on to talk about the issue of whether that really applies to the kind of projects that we're going to be doing. Okay, and they take, I think, they kind of go out on a limb here to some extent and say, because software projects have a lot of design uncertainty, okay, that these kind of planning tools really don't help us that much. We can't come up with a plan that's that detailed and exact, okay? Um, and they repeat the criticism. The criticism comes from the Agile folks. It says that planning is a waste of time, and that we ought to take all the time we put into planning and put that into creating working software. Okay. And somehow I think that the authors are getting kind of bogged down in some of the fights that you hear between the traditional people and the agile people. And I think that they're being as, I think that they're kind of taking the bait to a certain extent from the proponents in the agile camp. But they do go on and say, there's a lot of stuff that we have to do, especially when we're collecting the requirements and we're planning any kind of project. And this kind of idea that things would have to be done, somewhat sequentially, and the idea that we might have to, that we, that there's a value in being able to predict when we're going to be working on things. They have this idea that we can come up with what they call Gantt Light. Okay, And one of the features of their Gantt Light is it's not so mathematically driven, and you can start some activities before other activities are finished and all that kind of stuff. And I just want to go back and point out that even even in these project planning tools, which they're calling Gantt, there's it's possible to express a dependency between two activities where you can say that activity B has to start at the end of activity A, but you can start it 5 days early. Okay, so you can have what we call lead times, right? You have a dependency, but you say, well, you don't have to wait until activity A is absolutely over. You can start when activity A has got 5 days remaining. Okay, so you don't have to have this concept of Gantt Light in order to do that. The more detailed project planning approaches have had that concept in them from the get-go. Likewise, you don't have to say that you have to start activity B exactly at the end of activity A. You can say, well, I'm going to wait 5 days, and that's called a lag time instead of a lead time. So it's always been possible in these project planning applications to express relationships between activities in a more flexible way than they're showing here. So I don't think they make a really good argument for Gantt Light because those other project planning tools are too precise. But the idea that perhaps you could come up with a plan for a project and express it like this is a good idea. And in fact, this thing that we see, this is what the original Gantt charts were. Gantt charts were an expression of the work that had to get done on a project, in which we listed out all the work, and we showed over on the right side with a bar chart when we expected that to get done on the calendar. Okay, so this idea I think is a positive idea, but I don't think that they needed to denigrate traditional detailed project planning tools in order to get to this. All right. The next thing that they talk about is how to define project scope. And I think this is a good discussion because how we define project scope and how we document it, all that kind of stuff, is, I think, an essential element of the difference between the plan-driven approach and the agile approach. Okay, so in the columns, they've got the plan-driven approach, the hybrid approach, and the agile approach. The reason why I think they put so much of their sort of intellectual effort into the hybrid approach is that I think this is where they want to drive everybody. They have a point of view that kind of says that we ought to take the best things from plan driven and the best things from agile and create some kind of a hybrid, and that's probably going to be the fertile middle ground. Now, does everybody agree with them who's out in the field? No, I don't think that they do. You've got a lot of people who love Agile. You've got some people who love plan-driven. they have adopted things from Agile, but I don't think that they would call what they do hybrid. Okay. Okay. So those are the columns: planned, driven, hybrid, Agile, and then the rows are uh, what we're going to do for requirements, and then what we're going to do for construction. And the requirements has upfront requirements, documents, upfront scope, ongoing requirements. Okay. So if you look at what they say in this table, which I think reflects pretty accurately what they say in the chapter, um, I don't agree with what they say. So I'm gonna kind of warn you off of the conclusions that they have. Okay. So let's begin with Agile because I think they represent Agile pretty um, faithfully. So, what are the upfront requirements, documents for Agile? Uh, well, you develop a product backlog, and that is a list of the user stories. Okay, and so to do that, you identify the user stories. Okay, um, and when they say identify user stories, they don't only mean that you come up with user story names, but they also mean that you flesh out the user stories, the very lightweight expressions of the functionality of a system that fit on an index card. Okay. So they're saying that we're going to fill out the index cards, and we're going to defer detailed designs until construction. Okay. So that we don't have to give any more design details until we begin a sprint in which we're going to do that user story. Okay. I think that's true. Okay. With respect to scope, we prioritize the stories. Okay. And then optionally, we may use a minimum scope. So there's this constant concept of MVP, minimum viable product. So we have this idea that the scope is flexible, okay, but there's a certain kind of combination of user stories that we're going to absolutely have to get to have a viable product. Okay, and then in terms of emergent requirements, um, this is while we're working on the construction, we have emergent requirements. So we uncover details of the requirements. So we get, while we're doing the work during the sprint, we do get detailed requirements while that's happening. Um, we're going to get just barely good enough requirements, which is to say, we're always going to be asking ourselves, what features does this absolutely need right now? Okay. And while we're working on this, we're going to get customer feedback via sprint reviews. Okay. So I think this is a fair uh, idea of how this happens. And then the construction is happening to, during these iterations or sprints. Okay, so let's see what they have to say about plan driven or waterfall. Okay, so in terms of upfront requirements documents, fully detailed features and designs. Okay, now what some teams will do is that they'll do the requirements and then um, well, this is good. Up front we're going to do the fully detailed features and design. So we're going to document it all up front. Is it just going to be user stories? No. We're going to do more work. And in this class, we're going to express the requirements as use cases. We're going to write up use case specifications. Okay. And that's how we're going to do that. Okay, in terms of the scope, no scope changes once the project approved. Nobody believes this is true. Okay, so all of the people who are managing projects that are taking a plan-driven or waterfall approach, their point of view is the following. We'll always entertain changes to scope, provided that we can get the parties involved to agree that it's worth entertaining. So typically what they do is if somebody wants to propose a change to scope, they write up a little proposal. The team and the stakeholders review the proposal and they ask themselves, is it worth it for us to collect the details on this and further evaluate it? If they say yes, then they'll go and they'll collect the same information about the proposed changes that they did for the original features and the designs, okay? And then they'll estimate the work in that, okay? And then it's either adopted or not. If it's adopted, it comes with additional time and cost, right? So this idea that a traditional team won't propose, won't entertain changes to scope while the project is ongoing. I don't know if they meant to say that here, but they appear to say that here, and that's not true. Okay, and then ongoing requirements. A single long phase of construction precludes ongoing requirements. So a part of what they're saying here is true, and a part of what they're saying here is, I think, misleading. In this kind of requirements and design up front way of doing projects, when do the users and other stakeholders get to see things and approve them? Well, they get to see them up here, okay? We actually create a paper model of the system up front, okay? So we actually show people on paper and walk them through, okay, this is how it's going to work. This is what it's going to look like. These are the data that it's going to keep. Do you approve of that? Okay, so users approve and or give feedback to these requirements and designs in detail up front. It's just not the actual software. Okay, now, so to the extent that these things are pre-approved and we're only building them later on, well, that means that we're not going to the users and other appropriate stakeholders and getting approval of things as we build them. Okay, as long as what we build meets the requirements and the design, well, there's no reason really to show it to them. They've already signed off on it. What if we go to build something and we say, you know what? The documents, the paper model of the system that we approved up here, it's inconsistent. Or we think that certain things have happened in the world since people signed off on those designs, and they can't really mean that anymore. That's not a good. We've we think better of that. Can the team come back here and say, I think that the team, I think that we ought to consider a change in the requirements, a change in the design? Yeah, teams do that all the time. I mean, do they do that without asking? No, what they typically do is someone proposes a change, and then the powers that be will evaluate that, say, yeah, that's one we want to consider. And if they want to consider, then, you know, they gather the rest of the requirements. They do the design. They come up with the estimates to implement the software. It either gets approved or it doesn't, and then on they go. So this sort of idea that there's this inflexibility here, there is a kind of a delay that goes on because, at least in theory, all the all of the uncertainty and potential disagreements were had up here when we were building the paper model. Okay, so there are going to be fewer of those while we're building it, but uh, traditionally, if people discover problems or inconsistencies or insufficiencies given the way the world has changed while we're doing the construction, well, they bring it up. So some of the differences that you see here between these two, um, the way they're being characterized in the chapter and in particular in this chart, are not fair, right? So one of the reasons that I think that these guys are so high on hybrid is that they had this idea of plan driven that's really outdated, right? And so maybe what people really do who believe in plan driven is closer to what's going on in hybrid, right? So that's where we have. Um, I'm sorry. I don't think I really want to talk about that anymore. Okay. Um, so how do we identify user stories? So in the uh, in the parlance of Spurrier and Topi, they think that the high level expression of what the system should do should be documented in these things called user stories, right? Uh, and they would have us believe that both the traditional people and the agile people uh, subscribe to this user stories approach. And historically, that has not been true, right? The traditional people use these things called use cases, and the agile people use user stories. Now, how do use cases and user stories, how do they relate to each other? Well, they both are narrative descriptions of how the users will use the system to reach user goals. So, they're both uh, pretty comparable. Okay. Um, users, use case people, um, they have a lot of different ways that they write them. We're going to learn to write a use case one way. We're going to write a use case narrative that's pretty detailed. There are people uh, who claim that use case narratives ought to evolve over the life of a project. So the first time you write them, they ought to be really short and terse. and then the next time a little more detailed, and then the next time more detailed. And by the time you get done, they're very detailed, right? So I believe what Spurrier and Topi think is that the use case folks, if you look at the very summarized one that some of the use case people would begin with, it would look a lot like an Agile user story. So that'd be a good place to have everyone start, right? Well, this would be good if that's what people actually did. Okay. But the fact is, not everybody starts with user stories. Okay. So we're going to have uh, the Agile approach is going to start with user stories, and the plan-driven approach is going to begin with use cases. Okay. Now, they're both story-oriented narrative descriptions of how the users are going to use the system to drive user value. Okay, so what's the slide about that we're on now? Well, you remember a chapter or two ago, we were talking about activity diagrams. And we were saying that one could use activity diagrams in order to document what people did out in the business. If you went into the organization and you see all the work that they did in their continuing operations, that you could take the parts of that that are of interest to the project and you would be able to document with it with an activity diagram. So what they're saying here is that, well, if you did those detailed activity diagrams, something that I warned you off a couple of chapters ago, well then you could take these and you could pick parts of them and say, this is going to be my use case. This is going to be my user story. It's always a subset of what people are doing in the business, right? So we're going to pick that, and then we're going to describe the new way that it's going to work. Okay, so if you had not listened to Kevin and you had gone out there and diagrammed all the activity in the business with activity diagrams, well then now if you were looking for a use case or you were looking for a user story, you could go out and just kind of annotate the activity diagrams. You typically could draw a circle around or an ellipse around the activity that you're interested. That's going to be the user story. That's going to be the use case. That's the claim we have here. So our approach is going to be the following. So now, yeah, this slide asks the question, okay, once you've identified your use cases in the traditional approach, or once you've identified your user stories in the Agile approach, how do you figure out how you're going to do these things, right? Which ones are you going to build first, right? So when we're planning our Agile project in our class, we're going to have a list of user stories that make up this thing that we call the backlog, right? And then we are going to have a vision statement. Okay. So what they're saying here is, how do you come up with release planning? So what's release planning? Okay. Well, even though the Agile folks say that they don't do a lot of planning, okay, that's kind of the common way of describing Agile. It's not plan driven. They don't do a lot of planning. Well, they do significant planning. And when we read in the Layton book, we're going to see that they do a vision statement, they do a um, product backlog, and they do a uh, product roadmap. Okay, so the vision statement is what we're going to be focusing on when we're talking about um, initiating and planning. Okay, and the next thing that's part of initiating and planning is the product backlog. So we're saying, here's the vision, and here's all the user stories that are part of that vision. Okay. Uh, what is this stuff that has to do with release planning and product road map? Well, it has to do with the following thing. Um, Even though the Agile people say that we're not going to plan this whole thing up front, people are going to want to know, well, what parts are going to get done when? So a lot of Agile project planners have this approach where they have a road map for the project. So they take all those features that you have as user stories, okay, and then they go, well, when are we going to do them? Are we going to do them in sprint 1 or sprint 2 or sprint 18? Okay. Now, are they committing to do them at that time? No, they're not. They're just coming up with a hypothetical structure of the project. Now, why would they want to do that? Well, they want to show about when things are going to get done. Even though it's not a committed plan, they want to show that. And another thing is, a lot of Agile people have this idea that if you put things in the right order, that you might be able to release, this is why we call it release planning, parts of the software early. So you might be able to have a release 1 and then a release 2. So let's say that we're going to have 25 sprints that are 2 weeks long. It's going to take 50 weeks. Okay. Are we going to wait until the end of the 50th week to release the software for people to use in the field? Or are we going to want to have one halfway through and one at the end? Or one a quarter of the way through, one halfway through, one 3/4 of the way through, one at the end. So this release planning and product roadmap stuff, even though everybody says that Agile isn't big on upfront planning, these are meant to take the user stories and show about when we think they're going to get done. Okay? And that would help us to define some intermediate release products that would allow parts of our product to get into the field and start to create some value. Okay? So that's what this slide is all about. Okay? Um, so uh, this next slide is about how this would work, right? We'd look at all the user stories that we have, and we would pick the ones that we think should go into sprint 1, and then we'd have the remaining backlogs, and then we'd have to figure out sprint 2, and then we would go all through these things, right? Now, again, are we promising in the true Agile approach, are we promising that we're going to do these things in exactly the sprint in which they showed up when we were doing a product roadmap or release planning? The answer is no. Okay. We're just using our best guess in order to get, uh, to settle people down so that they have some idea about how we think it's going to go. Okay. But the way that the methodology works, every time we start a sprint, the technical team and the product owner look at the user stories that are left and they pick the ones that they think are the most uh, appropriate to go into the next sprint, and then they go do it. Okay. Um, so slide number 14 here is, I think, interesting. And it has to do, it kind of summarizes a couple of pages within that chapter. And that comes down to this. Does it really make sense, even if you're taking an agile approach, does it really make sense to say the things that we're going to work on in the next sprint are the most important things? Uh, it doesn't. Okay, and here's why. Unless we only have a handful of things, right, and they're not interrelated in any way, okay, then it's going to make sense in sometimes to pick things that are related. Okay, so you may have a list of, say, 50 things, and some of them are really, really important, okay, but they're not related to each other. And so you can't really get all of their value if you only pick them. You're going to have to pick the things that go with them. So the agile people have come up with this idea of you can take user stories that are related and you can say that they make up this thing called an epic or an epic user story. Okay, and that's what they're bringing in here. And they're saying that that what you're probably doing is that you're probably saying that you've organized these 50 user stories into, uh, you know, 8 epics. Okay. And then you're going to say which epic is most important, right? And then you'll probably mine out the first, the most important epic, and then you'll mine out the second, and then the third. And by doing that, you'll be building user stories that coordinate with each other and really do drive value in a more complicated system. Okay. And there's a couple of other things they talk about, in this point in the chapter that I think are interesting. They have this model that they call the Moscow model, in which they try to, distinguish between things that you must have, things that uh, they have a graded scale for things that you absolutely have to have down to things that you would like to have. Okay, so they're bringing in that. And the other thing that they bring in at this point in the discussion is this idea of an MVP, a minimal viable product. One important aspect of the agile approach is that we want to make sure that we don't build more product than we're really going to use. And one argument that the agile people use against the more traditional kind of upfront big requirements upfront is that it's very hard to get people to give up requirements up front, right? Everybody thinks, no, we need all this stuff. So the more we're doing details requirements up front, the more we're building a bigger system on paper. Okay, so they have this idea that one of the potential benefits that comes from Agile is that we can wait until we're actually building parts. And as long as we build the most essential parts first, we can actually go back to our constituents and say, okay, we've built this for you. Now, can you see that this is all you need? This is a viable product all by itself. How about you go and use this for a while and tell us how you feel? Because the other stuff that we've heard about from you, and we still have it on our list, okay, and we may pick it if your heart is really in it, but we think that after you try this configuration of the product, this minimal viable product, we think you're going to find out that this or something with this and just a few more features will be everything that you need, right? So this aspect of the agile approach, which they're saying now is the hybrid approach. This really harnesses one key aspect of agile is it's hard in waterfall kinds of approaches. It's hard to talk the user community out of some feature sets when it's going to be so long before they get them. Okay. And so what the agile people are doing is they're delaying collecting the detailed requirements on the rest of the feature sets, the potentially bloated portion of the feature sets, with the idea that they'll deliver this MVP, this minimal viable product, and then the users will realize that that meets their needs, that they weren't so hungry as they thought they were. It's just like, yeah, this is good. I just want a little dessert and I'll be done. Okay. And this is a major difference between the agile approach and the waterfall approach. Oh, so they're talking about this hybrid planning release as a way that we would consider this minimum viable product as a way of getting this done. So they're talking about we might have when picking the when describing the release planning, we might consider this MVP concept, and we might also consider that because stories are interdependent and perhaps make up these things called epics, that we would want to be sort of approaching this an epic at a time rather than a story at a time. So this is an agile release flight plan. So again, they're calling this a flight plan. The term of art that's used in the agile community is product roadmap. Okay, so this is a classic product roadmap where we are saying, okay, here are some kind of summarized categories of the user stories. Okay, and this could be these things. You could maybe call these epics, or they're just categories of the user stories. And we're saying, okay, here's when we're thinking we're going to do these, okay? And we're going to take advantage, we're going to take advantage of the how can we say this? The way that we're going to go at the sprints is not random, right? We're not going to really, let me not speak out of turn here. Okay, at the end of every sprint, we are going to say what are the most important things for us to work on. But here's what we think will come out of that analysis. We think that we're going to do these things in sprint 1. We think we're going to do this in sprint 2. We think we're going to do these things in sprint 3, right? We think here's when we think you're going to get things. So, these are calling guys are calling this a flight plan, but this is typically called a product roadmap. That's what it's called in the Layton book. So this is some kind of this is taking all of this information, this chart that we're looking for here is a user backlog. So this is the agile, a product backlog. So this is an agile way to describe all the things that have to get done and when we think we're going to do them. Okay. I don't think this really tells us too much more. Or this. Or this. Okay. So, again, I'm kind of apologizing for the chapter, right? Because, again, let me pull back to what we're doing in the current week of the course. Okay, where is it? It's right here. Okay. So in this course, we're not as worried about project management activities, which isn't to say they're not important, but it's really important to not get sidelined by project management considerations when you're trying to learn how to be a systems analyst. And systems analysts are primarily concerned with when we're doing initiating and planning, well, what's the scope of the effort going to be? What functionality has to be in the system to get the job done? Okay. So, again, what we're going to focus you on in the current week is some document that's from the waterfall genre that allows you to express what the scope of the effort is going to be, and that's what this project scope statement is. Okay. And as part of it, we're going to say what parts of functionality are going to be in it, and we're going to in our class we're going to stick to the more traditional way of expressing functionality in waterfall projects, and we're going to have use cases. What's the difference between use cases and user stories? Well, they're very similar things that come from two separate practices. You know, the use cases come from object-oriented analysis and design, and user stories come from agile software development. Okay, they're both narrative expressions of what the system is going to do and how the user is going to interact with it in order to get their job done. Okay, so in this week, we're going to be coming up with this scope document, and we're going to have it list the use cases that we expect to be in the scope of what we're going to do. Okay, and all these other things. Okay, now the chapter kind of talked about what we're going to do for next week. Okay, next week we're going to read from the Layton book. Okay, so let me back up and show you where that is. So next week we'll be in our week 6, and we're going to read from the Layton book. And chapter 9 from the Layton book, I think, does a less distracting version of this information about how we plan in Agile. Okay. And when we plan in Agile, we're going to have you doing 2 documents. We're going to have you do a product vision statement that's going to look like this. It's going to be very small. And we're going to have you do a product backlog, which is a list of user stories. And again, this is pretty terse as well. Okay, so my apologizing for the chapter in the current week is I think the authors are ambitious and they want to find a way that all these things can tie into a common set of language and all that kind of stuff. And while it's interesting to see it, I think it's burdensome intellectually. And so we're going to be taking a sort of slimmed down approach to what we're doing for waterfall, initiating and planning in the current week, and then an equally slim approach to what we're going to do for Agile, initiating and planning next week. So there you go. I'll look forward to discussing all this with you in class in the coming week, and I'll say bye for now. Bye-bye.